What's up, guys? This is Juan Jaramillo with Empower Homes Team Lead, and today we're going to be talking about submitting a purchase agreement, mastering Form 310. All right, so what are the kind of main topics that we're going to be talking about? So, why the purchase agreement is crucial. Before you start, what to do, key sections of the Form 310 purchase agreement, adding contingencies and addendums, submitting the offer, and what happens next. And then we'll end it with some common mistakes to avoid. So this video is really going to be for obviously the team in Power Homes, newer agents, and I think it's going to bring a lot of nuance. So I think there'll be a lot of value even for those agents that have been in the business for a little bit. I think it's just a different perspective, especially for those who have a little bit more experience. My perspective of what how best to submit a purchase agreement and how I fill it out. All right, let's start with why the purchase agreement is crucial. Obviously, it legally binds the buyer and seller on the transaction. It essentially, I've actually dealt with in a lot of my business. Sorry, I lost the train of thought. A lot of my business is actually with a lot of people that kind of do that for sell by owner, buyer, and seller. And sometimes what happens, it's a handshake deal. Not a lot of the terms are figured out. It's not just purchase. It's not just the purchase price. Obviously, it's not just the closing day. There's a lot of nuance, and it can get super simple or it can get complex depending on the situation. And so it's really important to just kind of have everything written down and signed. Make sure everything's agreed to, and which actually brings us to the next point. It sets clear, and it does that by setting clear terms for the sell. All right. It protects your client's interest and mitigates risk. This is a big piece of why the purchase agreement is super important to have everything written down. And I would actually suggest, especially for all the newer agents, if your clients ask for something or mention something's important to them about this home. I'll give you an example. Maybe there's a cracked window and they mention that it's important. I'd probably go ahead and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I'll probably go ahead and add that into the purchase agreement as one of the addendums or even contingencies. It establishes a framework for a smooth closing process. Our biggest job, I think, as realtors, mentioned it before, really as advisors, but our job really starts once we're under contract with clients. It's not so much, and it's partly, helping people find a home, but I think the biggest value add an agent brings to the table is their experience once they get under contract and how to solve issues and problems to then get to the closing table as smoothly as possible, but more importantly, knowing what exactly it is that they're buying. All right, so before you start, what should you be working on? Ensure you have all the necessary disclosures. It's not always just a pre-approval letter and the disclosure. Keep an eye on the age of the home that you're about to buy, or sometimes there's unique sellers or listing agents that are asking for a specific document. So always check the MLS to see if there's any additional disclosures that they want you guys to go ahead and send. Double check your client's offer, price, terms, and contingencies. And this is going to happen sometimes. And by this, I mean, when you put an extra zero, you're thinking 250 and it's really 350. That's going to happen. So double check, triple check, make sure that's accurate, make sure that's correct. And we'll go over the times I go and check several times a contract because your eyes are looking at contracts a lot, and especially if it's the same one. And so errors are very easily missed because you're just not seeing what's right in front of you sometimes. So I'll kind of go over when I go and kind of triple check the contract. But yeah, you definitely want to make sure that it's all accurate. Review the property details. And what I mean by this is not just the documents, but it's also, if you look at the remarks section, a lot of the times the listing agent will put kind of information there, quite important information. Sometimes they'll go ahead and say, hey, just submit offers that are at least 1% in earnest money. You can negotiate. People can say as is, and you can still send an offer that's a due diligence, right? And so it's important to check that information almost as context as to what offer it is that the seller prefers. And that might be important when it's a multiple offer situation. But if you're the only one offering offering, or yeah, if you're the only buyer that's submitting an offer, then I don't think it's really that. It's important to know about it and be aware of it, but I don't think it's that important to actually follow it. I mean, an offer is an offer, right? I hope that makes sense, guys. All right, communicate with listing agent for any specific seller preferences. This is actually an extremely important topic. I like to call the listing agent, ask them, what else is important to them other than the purchase price. Most of the time, it's purchase price, clean offer. You'll hear that all the time, but sometimes something about the date is important. It could be, hey, we actually, although we're only looking for cash offers, we actually want a 60-day close, not a 15-day close. Or sometimes they say, hey, as soon as possible, something's important about next week and we want it to close ASAP. So those little details that can be super important and actually help you win an offer or help you negotiate a better purchase price because you're willing to concede on other terms. That's important to the sellers. That might not be important to the buyer. So that's why it's extremely important to kind of pay attention to what the listing agent says and make sure you communicate with the listing agent before you submit the offer. Key sections of Form 310. So the legal names, confirming correct legal names. So a lot of the times you'll have somebody on FUB, and it's funny, it happens. Let's say his name is Robert. And what you might not know is his first name is Kevin, and Robert could just be a nickname for all you know. And so you'll send them over to a lender. The lender says, hey, I've got a Kevin, I don't know, Smith, and you have no idea who this Kevin Smith is, right? Then you later find out that it's actually the same lead that you had or the same client that you had, but he just goes by Robert. That happens a lot of the time. So something I always ask before, like once they decide they're going to submit an offer, go ahead and ask them for the correct legal name and ask them who's going to be on the title of the property. The key thing here is actually something I learned about a year ago, and most attorneys don't care, most lenders don't care, but it does happen every so often. The parties on the buyer side of the contract, those are technically on the buyer side, those technically only have to be those who are going to be the borrower. So let's say it's a husband and wife situation. The husband's on the loan, the wife isn't. You don't have to put the wife's name on the buyer side, on the buyer's area of the contract. You just have to put her on the title of the contract, kind of like below. I believe it's page 1, if not page 2, in that paragraph where it says who will be on the deed of the home. That's where you would put everybody that's going to be on the deed of the home, not necessarily those who are on the buy side. And if you have any questions about my awful explanation, feel free to DM us. Okay, purchase price. Specify offer amount and financing method. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, on the seller's name, feel free to check the tax records. The tax records aren't always right. So sometimes I leave it blank. Sometimes I fill it out. Usually, rule of thumb, if you want it to be a super clean offer and you're like, um, let's say highest and best, go ahead and fill out the seller's name. It's easy to change. If it's not highest and best, I usually leave it blank, let the listing agent fill it out just in case it's different. If you really want to go above and beyond, just ask the listing agent. He'll let you know. All right, purchase price. Specify offer amount and financing method, cash, loan, etc. So you'll see on the first section, it's like that says cash, combination, and then financing. All that means is either all cash, a combination of cash, which is just that they have a down payment, and then financing would be for those that don't have a down payment, like VA or USDA loan, something like that. So that's where you'll specify that. Property description. Ensure that the addresses, legal description are accurate. One thing to check, especially specifically in this area, is just make sure that you have the tax map ID. You can find that at the tax records or at the MLS. Just go ahead, just copy and paste it into it to make sure it's 100% accurate. And then the can't pronounce that. And closing, covenants, conveyance, and closing. It's important to know what closing date, because it's super important. It's super annoying, super important, and it kind of messes with people's experience, to be honest with you, if the closing date gets pushed back, depending on the situation. Obviously, if the home is vacant, nobody really cares for the most part. It's just annoying in terms of when the wire is going to hit the seller's bank account, and you don't want them to start questioning if your buyer is actually going to get to closing or not. It just, becomes a crap sandwich. But it is a lot of the times people kind of schedule movers. There's a lot of the times people have a lot of things counting on or banking on that closing date. So it's extremely important to make sure that, first of all, if it's a cash deal, that the title search can come back on time, because you don't want to do a 2-week close and then you find out you just screwed your, well, I don't want to say screwed, but your client now has to pay $250 in order to do a rush fee, or now I've heard it's upwards of $400 or $500 to do a rush fee to close on time because you didn't call the title company to ask them if they can get it done in 2 weeks without having to pay a rush fee. So if you're looking to close as soon as possible, just reach out to your title attorneys. Reach out to your lender to make sure that they can get the job done, and especially if you want it to be a competitive offer, do that due diligence. It's going to save you a world of hurt, and it's going to make your offer just look that much better. Rule of thumb is going to be 30 days to 45 days for a loan, especially if it's a VA or USDA. And then for cash deals, now depends on how busy your title company is or your attorneys are. I usually just do 3 weeks, and I let them know if we can, especially if it's a vacant home, if we can, we can close sooner because that's usually easier to close sooner than to push back the date. And then earnest money, outline the deposit amount, form of payment, and escrow details. This part, it's important. You want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to get the earnest money over to the attorneys, and you want to talk to your clients about how you're going to get it to the attorneys. You have the Earnest app; they charge about $18 a fee, but you can just do it digitally, especially if they're tech savvy and super busy. You can just do a personal check. And to be honest, you can, in some title attorneys, I've noticed that you can just wire the money. They have the instructions there on the website. I'm pretty sure all attorneys can do wire the money, but some attorneys have it in their website where they can just go in and wire it. It's super convenient. So make sure you have that cleared up too. All right, completing the agreement. Try to fill out every section. I remember hearing this tip actually from one of the agents I've done a transaction with, and they make sure that every section has something there. Don't leave any blanks. Now, I say that, but it's very difficult sometimes if you use the Authentisign, the GGAR, like the zip forms, because they don't let you just put zero, and they don't let you put in in sections where only numbers can go in. So sometimes you have no choice. But if you do have a choice, I think it's a really good rule of thumb is leave no blanks. Clearly state any contingencies. And this part is important because you want to set the right expectations for all parties involved in the transaction. You want to make sure that the financing contingency, inspection contingency, all that is usually pretty standard stuff. But if there's any unique kind of contingency, you want to make sure that they're aware of it, because you don't want to get to a point where, yes, technically it's signed, but the sellers weren't aware of it. Even though you're legally in the right, this is real estate, this is an emotional transaction. A lot of the times, if the seller backs out, it's going to be really hard to rectify that, if you may. So it's just better to avoid that situation altogether, in my opinion. Triple check all key terms of the contract. Okay, so this is where I check. So the first time you check is when you're submitting the contract. The second time I check the contract is when I'm putting down the signatures. A lot of the times it's just an automatic, the Authentisign automatically puts the signatures where it needs to be. But I'll go ahead and actually check the terms, the purchase price, every single blank. I'll go ahead and make sure that that's all correct. And what I'll do is, before sending it to my clients for them to sign, I reread the MLS description and make sure that everything that they suggested is either on the contract or at least that I'm aware of it. And then the third time I check this after my clients sign it. Just check the contract again, make sure it's all good, and then submit it. All right, adding contingencies and addendums. Here are some of the very common contingencies that you'll see in most contracts. You got the financing contingency, specify the loan type, terms, approval timeline. Inspection contingency, define the due diligence period. Usually it's 2 weeks, but it could be 7 days, could be a month. It really just depends. For the financing contingency, there's usually two sections there. You'll see where it says, has your client applied for pre-approval, and has your client received a pre-approval? A couple nuance on that, and I'd love to talk to a lender about it. But if a lender's told me that that's just a normal pre-approval, but somebody else has also told me that he spoke with a different lender and they said it's a pre-approval specific to that real estate or specific to that property. And so she usually puts 2 weeks out for the pre-approval stage, even if they've already gotten a pre-approval and applied for a loan. So I would test out both things. I've done it with the same date that you submit the contract, because it doesn't let you do a date before, at least in our system. And I've had no issues with it besides that one time I had it with that one listing agent. So it's really up to you guys. You just common practices, appraisal contingency. That's a really common one, especially with the loan, conventional FHA, whatever. There are certain times where you can get the appraisal waived. Very rarely the time where I would recommend to get the appraisal waived, because why get it waived? So especially because it kind of protects the buyer more than anything. A couple of times that you might want to get it waived is multiple offer situations. The buyer doesn't want to pay for it. The buyer doesn't care if he does end up overpricing it, or you guys feel extremely confident in the value of the property. So at that point, why get the appraisal? Addendums include repairs, seller concessions, or specific terms. So I think this is an open kind of debate as to when to ask for certain repairs. And the repairs I'm talking about aren't the ones that come into the inspection report. They're the ones that you're walking the home and you say, wow, this home is perfect. I want to submit an offer. But that window is cracked. And I would like them to fix that window. Do you ask for that repair out of the gates, or do you ask for it in due diligence? My recommendation would be to go ahead and ask for it out of the gates. Why? Because if it's during the due diligence, what if they say no? They just say, no, I'm not going to do that. Yes, you can back out, but then you're gonna have to pay the $500 termination fee, right? So why not just ask for it up front? Be on the same page with the seller. Hey, I want this fixed. I don't care if it comes up in the report or not. And I've actually had cracked windows that haven't come up in a report. It probably slipped, and or it has come up in the report, but the way it comes up in the report is either confusing or it gets kind of lost in the 100 items that come up in the report. And so I would just go ahead and ask for those items up front that you see on your wall. Just go ahead and ask for them. Make sure that you're on the same page with the seller and say, hey, Mr. Seller, yes, I'm gonna pay $200K for your house, but only if you're gonna fix X, Y, and Z, right? I think that's the way I prefer it. It's obviously up to your discretion, and see what experiment with both. Check both of those things out and see, or test both of those things out and see what works best for you and your client. Okay, the next thing to take into account for the addendums is the seller concessions. Keep in mind, is it FHA? Is it a conventional loan? Is it a VA loan? What type of loan is it? Because that will affect how much the seller concession can be given or can be received from the seller. So be careful with that. I know if FHA and conventional is different. I believe, if I'm not wrong, conventional you can only receive, and check with your lender and on the data, because if you see this in 2 years, everything probably changed. But with conventional, I believe you can only receive 3% in seller concessions. Well, with FHA, you can receive up to 6% in seller concessions. So check with them before you submit the offer, especially if you're going to ask for a ton of seller concessions up front. And then specific terms, some specific terms, and actually I would add to this is, and it's happened to me before, is if your client is expecting some personal property to stay with the real estate, go ahead and ask for it. And actually go ahead and ask them if there is any personal property that they want to stay with the home. Also, check the MLS to see what personal property that the seller is expecting to leave with the home. Because you can also negotiate and say, hey, I don't want that fridge. Make sure they take it, because, moving a fridge from the house is pretty much, it's a pain. And especially if your clients, let's say, aren't physically well enough to move it on their own, they're gonna have to pay somebody to do it. Or even if they don't want to move it on their own, they're gonna have to pay for somebody to do it, right? So you want to go ahead and kind of get ahead of those details. Okay, submitting the offer. What do you do after it's typed up? You review the completed agreement with your client before submission. Make sure they understand it, especially if your client doesn't speak English as their first language. You want to review it with them. Make sure they understand what they're signing. I don't care how And you'll have this all the time. Your clients just kind of they trust you blindly, and they'll just say, "I just signed everything. I didn't read it. I trust you on." No, no. Make sure that they understand what they're signing. All right. Submit the offer to the listing agent via email. Include all supporting documents, pre-approval letter, proof of funds. Um, Probably the seller's disclosure is another one that they're gonna ask for, the LBP, if lead-based paint addendum, if the home is old enough. You want that all to be included in one email. One thing I wanted to add is, and I think I have it here in the next one. Yep, is follow up with the listing agent to make sure that they received it. It's happened to me before, and it's unfortunate to the buyers and to really all parties. It'll happen a lot too whenever you have a multiple offer situation, especially you just have a listing, you have five, six offers. It really happened 2020, 2021. But, if you have one of those listings nowadays, you will have offers go straight to your spam account. You will, because either they send it through the dot loop link. Please don't do that. Please send it at least through a PDF. But if you do, or if you send a ton of different PDFs, sometimes Gmail will flag it as spam and it will just go straight to the spam thing. And you might not see it, and to be able to review it and send it over to your clients, and that would just suck, right? That would just be a really crap sandwich, especially. And it's never happened to me, but I mean, I'm sure it's happened before where it just goes to spam. You received another offer that wasn't as good. The one that went to spam never communicated with the listing agent to let them know that they were sent an offer. They accepted one that was lesser than the one that went to spam. Could you imagine that conversation with your clients? That sucks. So, especially as a buyer's agent too, I mean, come on. So let's completely avoid that. Text the listing agent, email the listing agent, or within your email, you say, "Please confirm receipt." Text the listing agent, "Hey, I just emailed you the offer. Please confirm receipt." And if you don't hear confirmation, follow up with them. Make sure that they've confirmed receipt of the email. And then, okay, what happens next? Well, there's a couple situations, right? After you submit the offer, they either accept it, the seller signs, and the contract is binding, and you're off to the races. Counter offer, negotiate terms if needed, updating the agreement accordingly. So one thing I do with the counter offer is I do it pretty informal, just something written. If I do give them a call, I'll text them or email them those terms that we just spoke about, just so there's some kind of something written about the counter offer. Then once we come to an agreement, if we come to an agreement, I like to have a pretty clean contract. So I just rewrite the whole contract with the new terms and then send it out for everybody to sign. Rejection: guide your client on their options if the offer is not accepted. So if it's just a straight rejection, or you guys couldn't come to an agreement, the listing agent should, and I do say should send you a rejection of offer letter. At that point, your buyers can either resubmit an offer or you just keep moving. Really, there's not that many different options. Not many options. There's just either you resubmit an offer to a little higher for the sellers to respond at least or accept it, and or you just kind of keep moving, look for another house. And then expired offer. So understand when an expired offer and how to handle it. So this really depends, and a lot of this real estate stuff is a depends situation. Technically, after an offer is expired, in order to you're just gonna have to update the offer, get everybody to sign it with the new expiration date to make sure it's valid. But after the offer is expired, that offer is no longer valid, right? And so at that point, I would expect the listing agent or the seller to send you a rejection letter, and then you just kind of move forward from there. If you want to resubmit an offer, you can resubmit an offer at that point. This might be bad advice. I'm not an attorney, but one thing I do is if we're counter offering at that, and the offer tends to expire, for me, I don't lose any sleep on it, especially if we're still kind of having that conversation as to if we're going to come to an agreement or not. I don't lose any sleep for it. Just whenever you come to a verbal agreement, go ahead and update the contract up to the expiration of offer, and then get everybody to sign it. It's not out of this world. That's 9 out of 10 times what I would do. Common mistakes to avoid: incomplete terms in the offer. That is quite common. Sometimes the certain, let's say the CL 100, it's either yes, it's a contingency, or no, it's a contingency, and it's either check mark. Make sure you check off one of those two. There is the due diligence time frame. Sometimes it's blank. Make sure it's at least in A, or at least let them know that, hey, it's going to be as is, and the addendum below that, like no due diligence, as is. You want to make sure that for the most part everything's completed. Failing to include contingencies, that's a pretty big deal, especially the appraisal one. If your client wants an appraisal and it doesn't appraise, but you forgot to do the appraisal contingency, that's a pretty big deal. Failing to ask for personal property when client expects it, yeah, that's also a big deal. That you'll find out in the final walkthrough. A lot of the times, you'll walk the home and you're like, "Yo, I thought the fridge was gonna be here," and you go back to check the contract because you probably don't remember, and there is no personal property there. I mean, what are you going to say to your clients? You're going to need to fix that or have that hard conversation with your client, right? So that's a pretty big deal, pretty big mistake to avoid. Setting the wrong expectations is a huge deal, and this happened to me once. Thankfully, I was on the other party that didn't set the wrong expectations, but it happened to the other agent, where he didn't let the for the seller concessions. He didn't let his clients know that the seller concessions can't be more than what closing costs are. So if you offer 10K in seller concessions, but the closing costs are only 8K, they're not going to give you just write you up a 2K check, for the difference. Like it's just going to be 8K, and that's it. And it's up to the agent to understand that and either negotiate the purchase price to drop the purchase price some, or just let it be. A lot of times, it's not a huge difference. It's usually a couple hundred, so it's not a big deal. But in this situation, it was about $800, $900, and you need to know your client. And this client was a high C. So for those who don't know, a high C, just think about a highly detailed engineer kind of personality, that all those numbers need to make sense for them in order for them to move forward. That pushed the deal back a week. We were at the closing table, and he didn't understand why the heck he wasn't getting a two or an $800 check. We had to push back the closing. Nothing else changed. We had to push back the closing. We had to calm him down after waiting for 2 hours, or his agent had to calm him down. We finally came to an agreement, and we made it work. But yeah, I mean, all of a sudden, that's a 5-star review, super smooth process. Now you, as an agent, you look like an a-hole that doesn't know what they're doing, and it all comes back to setting the wrong expectations. A lot of the times, this is where we get in trouble, is setting the wrong expectations. And if you're not setting any expectations, they're going to have the wrong ones most of the time, they've done this before. A couple tips for success, or final tips: always review the agreement 3 times before submitting the offer. Trust me, 3 times. Communicate effectively with your client and the listing agent, especially if you find an error, or it's either a harder client, a harder transaction. The harder and more complicated the transactions are, the more communication you should have with your clients. Set proper expectations. Make sure that you do the buyer consult. Make sure you walk them through what they should be expecting. If you see a huge list of items in the due diligence period and the inspection report, let them know, hey, we can ask for all of it. However, the seller will probably not fix all of it. So we'll have to come to a decision if we're either okay with what the seller is going to fix, or it makes sense for us to back out. And then that's kind of how you set the proper expectations. Be careful how you set the proper expectations, because if you're not careful, you're gonna come off as if you're negotiating against your client. You do not want to ever come off as if you're negotiating against your client. You want to come off as if you're educating your client with the different options that they have, and then let your client decide what it is that makes the most sense for them. And then follow up consistently to keep the transaction moving. That's extremely important. Make sure you have a process where you're on a minimum reaching out to your client once a week. And that's if you have a TC also reaching out to them, right? If you don't have a TC, try 2 or 3 times a week while they're under contract, so they know exactly what's going on in the process. And guys, that's it. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Again, this is Juan Miller with Empower Homes. If you guys are interested in more real estate training, check out our videos, check out our website, our blog. I think it's just launching. When you guys see this, it would have been about a week ago. And if you guys are interested in having a conversation about joining a team here in the upstate, looking for other opportunities, I was going to say abroad, but it's not abroad. Let's say nationwide. You guys are interested in to see what Real Broker has in store, feel free to reach out. All our information going to be below. Thanks for your time. Have a good day.